I'm Aaron Thompson. I'm one of the co-leads for our Environmental Justice Special Initiative with the Institute for Sustainable Future. I'm in landscape architecture, and so I do a lot of community-based projects, sometimes with communities that have experienced trauma in various ways, and we work on public health issues, but I've never described myself as an environmental justice researcher. Part of what we're doing with this community is trying to help all of us, whether we consider ourselves environmental justice researchers or working with those who do that work so that we're adjacent to it. I want to make sure that everybody kind of has a broader understanding of where we're at, and we're trying to build some community around this idea. With that in mind, what we're going to do today is we actually have 3 speakers. Ellen Wells is going to get us started here in just a moment. And what I've challenged each of these speakers to do is that I've challenged them to define environmental justice from their own disciplinary perspective, right? And so we've selected policy sciences, environmental sciences, and then I'm going to say broadly public health and epidemiology, I think, is the other perspective that we'll get to here in a minute. And so what I'd like to do with our time here this afternoon is that we're going to go ahead and record these videos. And so we are recording right now. We're going to be holding a follow-up event later this semester where we're going to actually ask everyone who's attending to make sure that they've viewed these videos in advance and have an opportunity to connect their own work back to these definitions that are coming from our environmental justice experts. That in-person event will have a networking component to it, and so we're going to hopefully get to learn more about the breadth of environmental justice work happening here at Purdue, but we really want to ground that in an understanding coming from experts here on our own campus. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and organize this. That we've asked them to give us about 10 to 15 minutes defining environmental justice from their disciplinary perspective. You can, at any point in time, you can go ahead and drop comments into the chat window, and we will go ahead and save those. I'm going to attempt to go ahead and just back to back these 3 presentations, and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. Does anybody have any questions before we get going? All right. Ellen, I've made you a co-host so that you can go ahead and share anything that you're, if you want to share your screen or anything, you should be able to do that. Let's just make sure your mic's working here real quick.
Is it? I hope I'm.
Yeah, I think we're great. So, all right, well, I'll give a quick introduction. Dr. Ellen Wells is an associate professor in the Department of Health and in the Department of Public Health. Her areas of expertise are epidemiology, occupational and environmental health, and environmental public health. More than that, for me, is that as a co-lead of the Environmental Justice Initiative, Ellen helps provide me with expertise about what environmental justice is and isn't, and makes me feel better about starting to talk about my work in these terms. And so I'm excited to have her kick off this afternoon's session, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Aaron. I should say that I actually have a joint appointment. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Health, and I'm also an associate professor in the School of Health Sciences. So there's that double duty that I've got here. And so I thought this was kind of a challenging topic to talk about environmental justice from a disciplinary perspective, because I think of environmental justice as very much an interdisciplinary topic. But moving along, here's my take on that. So I thought I'd start off with a definition of environmental justice from an environmental health, public health perspective. All people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, are entitled to equal protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Just as a comment here, I think this definition is pretty consistent with other ones I've seen from other organizations, where it incorporates both environmental issues, health issues, as well as policy issues and involvement with policy making and like agency of communities as well. All right, so to start off with, I thought I would start off with a simplified version of the environmental health paradigm. So I'm in environmental health and public, which is a subset of public health. And the goal of environmental health as a discipline is to understand how factors in the environment affect our health. So this is a simplified version of the schematic that we use to look at this. And so first off, we think at the beginning of this process, we live, work, and play in a variety of environments that have a variety of things in them. And based on where we are in our lives, where we live, where we work, where we play, individuals can be exposed to various factors in their environments. Some of them are beneficial, but the ones that we're talking about today are more likely to be detrimental. And all of those factors then affect our health in either beneficial or detrimental ways. So that's kind of the overall schematic of environmental health, is that there are factors in the environment, humans get exposed to them, and then they affect the way that our bodies and our health works. So to put environmental justice into this mix, environmental justice has impacts at every single one of these levels. So on the first slide, environmental justice, I think of starts with disparities in environmental quality. So it starts with, we have great documentation now that not all people live in the same quality environments. Some places are more polluted than others. And what we have found over and over again with study after study is that individuals living in environments that have more pollution tend to be more disadvantaged populations on either socioeconomically or by racial minorities, are more likely to live in environments that have greater amounts of environmental pollution. And just as one example, I thought I'd pull examples of all these for you. The most recent report from the American Lung Association, their State of the Air report, where they report on basically how well communities across the country are doing with managing air pollution. And so failing grades in this means that they have a failing grade and that they did not meet national level EPA regulations for air quality. So what they found in their most recent report is that people of color are 3.6 times more likely to live in an area that has air pollution above the regulatory limits for 3 different types of air pollution. And so by 3 different types, I mean like 3 different types of gases, so ozone, particulate matter, and that sort of thing. So this is a pretty staggering statistic. 3.6 times is quite a lot. So we have here, this is just one example of how there is environmental injustice based on where we live, in that persons of color and persons of lower socioeconomic status and persons with other disadvantages, it's documented that they live in areas that have more hazardous pollutants in the environment to start with. And then the second part of this, that individuals are exposed to factors in these environments, that leads to impacts of disparities in exposure. So the next step along this pathway is that we also have some documentation that individuals that would be considered part of environmental justice communities, so again, persons of color and persons on lower socioeconomic status, they tend to have higher levels of exposure to environmental contaminants than other persons. To give you another example, and this one is just from a recent paper that got published, but the data that led to this was collected by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where Black children have a 2.8 times higher odds of having high lead levels compared to other children. And basically what this is that Black children are 2.8 times more likely to have lead poisoning than other children. And this is pretty consistent with other measures that I've seen around the country. So not only we have these environmental factors, we've already seen that people of color, people of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to live in areas that have these hazards. And we are starting to have more documentation that not only that, but those communities are literally exposed to those contaminants at higher levels, at a measurable level in their bodies. And then the third part of this, and that these factors affect our health, would be that we can then see disparities in health outcomes. And so for one example of this, and this is from data from the American Public Health Association, where they found in 2016, asthma affected 15.7% of Black children versus 7.1% of white children. So essentially, Black children had asthma at twice the rate of white children. You know, and one major component to asthma is air pollution, which I mentioned previously, that people of color are more likely to live in areas with more air pollution. So the statistic is not too surprising that it follows through with that. Air pollution is not the only cause of asthma, but it's certainly a major contributor there. So from the environmental health perspective, just going back to this slide a little bit, the things that we are very concerned about is understanding where pollutants are in the environments where we live, work, and play, which is a phrase I'm borrowing for the Environmental Protection Agency. How much of these contaminants are individual people or communities exposed to, and what is the connection between exposure to these contaminants and our health? And so we're interested in exploring these, all three of these facets here along the paradigm, and there's been documented issues of environmental injustice along all three parts of these. So moving on, we were also asked to talk about kind of the history of environmental justice from our disciplinary perspective. So a lot of what we think about of environmental justice from an environmental health perspective has to do with actions in the community and how those led to recognition in national regulations that protect people from the harm of hazardous pollutants. So a lot of this started back in the 1970s and 1980s. I'm just going to go through this real quickly, so this is not an extensive review. But among that time, we started to see a lot of protests against mainly landfills and toxic waste sites from various communities, and that led to two very well-known publications that are attributed as really starting the environmental justice movement overall: the Toxic Waste and Race in the United States by the United Church of Christ Commission, and Dumping in Dixie by Robert Bullard, who is considered the father of environmental justice. So moving on from there, I'd say in the 1990s, there was late 80s and 90s, we started to see benefits from those early community activities, trying to get attention to the fact that there were disparities in how people are exposed to environmental pollutants and how they affect our health. And they resulted in a series of legislation, mainly targeting the EPA, that attempted to address these problems, and they did somewhat. So one of them is the Emergency Planning and Right to Know Act. And so this increases the transparency of federally collected data related to pollution. The Office of Environmental Justice at the EPA was formed in 1992, and Clinton had an executive order in 1994, and this is a picture from him signing it, that emphasized that environmental justice should be considered in all US federal actions. And so as a result of this, what I've seen is that environmental justice is something that the EPA in particular and other agencies to some degree needed to at least discuss when they're working on various programs and issues, although the extent to which it got incorporated can be a little questionable. And other opportunities and research started to come about, but I'd say in a pretty slow manner. More recently than that, there's been an increasing amount of research in environmental justice, although from my perspective in public health and environmental health, there still is very little research on this area comparatively. But in the 2000s to 2015, things like community-based participatory research, which is research method where scientific investigators really work very closely with individual communities to develop ideas, and feedback information was developed. And this is a big part of a lot of environmental justice research. So that model of research was really developed, became widespread, I should say, during this time. And more community movements and things became developed. From my perspective, so this is my take on the history of EJ as it relates to public health, is that kind of after 2016, and especially after the death of George Floyd, there's been a huge increase in interest in environmental justice from a lot of people across disciplines that didn't necessarily give a lot of attention to environmental justice previously. So a lot more people are talking about environmental justice as an issue. There is increased research projects, there are increased surveillance projects, and by far increased federal funding projects, and federal funding targeting environmental justice ideas from federal institutions that previously we would never have anticipated would be concerned about this. But that's a good move because environmental justice is so interdisciplinary. And this graphic I have on here is just one example of the increased surveillance. One of the amazing things that's happened in this field in the past 2 years is that you can now find environmental justice mapping tools on at least 3 different federal agency websites. You can go to a federal agency website and look up your own zip code, and it'll tell you how many Superfund sites are nearby and a lot of other map layers that you can look at to try and understand where hotspots for environmental injustice might be. And so this is just one example from the Environmental Protection Agency, and what it's highlighting here is air pollution. So for those of you who were curious. So challenges and opportunities with environmental justice. And again, from my standpoint, we have challenges that we have increasing data about it, but they're still limited. And I think in particular, they're still fragmented. We have data from a lot of sources, but they come from different sources, so they're not integrated. So for example, looking at all those surveillance sites we have a lot of information about where air pollution is, and we have information about where people of lower socioeconomic status and people of color are living. So we can map those over and see geographically where they match, but the scientific data connecting those two as a important case is still somewhat limited, right? So we have data that there are people with health disparities, and we have data that there are people who are exposed to more air pollution, but still limited data that those two people are the same ones, that the environmental justice problem of pollution is directly affecting health. And so there's a mindset also to protect the typical case versus the worst case scenario. And with this, I'm just vaguely referring to a lot of environmental regulations. So environmental regulations are often designed to protect what we would think of as average exposures. And if you do that, it completely ignores the worst case exposure, which would be what environmental justice communities are exposed to. So it's not, so the regulatory system isn't necessarily designed to account for environmental injustice issues. And then disparities are historically entrenched in society, which is a big problem. However, at this period of time, we still have a lot of opportunities in that I said there's much more recognition of environmental justice than there used to be. There's much more support and funding out for environmental justice, and more tools to find information and get started to work on these issues. And I think we'll see a lot more information and detailed analysis of this and work with communities on environmental justice issues in the next couple of years. And so for those who are curious, these are 2 very good public health and environmental health review papers that talk about the history of environmental justice from a public health perspective. And that's all. Hopefully I kept to time.
You're great, Ellen. So thanks so much. At this point in time, if you have questions for Ellen, feel free to go ahead and drop anything you want into the chat. We'll go ahead and have a chance to circle back to those and let the speakers respond to them. But let's go ahead and jump over Andrew Flachs from the Department of Anthropology. Dr. Flachs is an associate professor. His research spans sustainable agriculture, food studies, the anthropology of knowledge, and political ecology. Through this work, he seeks to better understand how humans create sustainable environmental relationships within the context of markets, ecology, state interventions, and social networks. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. And I'll turn it over to you to give the social science perspective.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Ellen. A lot to agree with there in setting some of the base conditions. So where anthropology or qualitative social science and quantitative social science might jump in here and try to make some contribution to this literature is in a kind of base accepting of all the conditions that Ellen just spoke about. We take it as a given that if there are, from this perspective, if there are inequalities in a larger society, one of the ways in which those inequalities in a larger society will manifest is through the ways in which people interact with the environment. And so those inequalities might have all manner of genesis. If we look at them socially as functions of power, then they'll break across our intersectional lines. So racism, sexism, classism, questions of citizenship, anything that would intersect with some kind of social or political power would then have an ecological manifestation. And so we take that as a given within an unequal society, such as the United States and everywhere. These disparities of these negative impacts could go across a whole range of things. So Ellen talked a lot about health and various ways in which we know that there are contaminants that cause harm to human and other kinds of bodies. We could also look at things like real estate. We could look at the work that people do. We could look at other measures of human potential. All of them are going to break across issues of power, intersectionally understood across society. A lot of the early work that is influential to anthropology comes out of these geographic EPA kinds of reports. And so there's this very clear signal immediately when we being the United States government, begins tracking these connections across space between what in that time would be called like toxic sinks or sources of contamination, and those people who are most affected by it, that there's an immediate signal that these areas are linked to other aspects of power, most aggressively income and race. So the less white you are, the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be living near, in the United States, one of these sources of contamination. The early work on this that bounded that understanding of environmental justice comes out of essentially linking dumps to neighborhoods where people live. We can expand this out quite a lot with a broader understanding of manifestations of power, because we can start to see environmental justice not just through an explicit contamination risk of your food or your water or your air or your soil, as if those weren't bad enough, but also some of these larger infrastructural manifestations. Where are highways built? To take some of the most famous examples of urban planning in the 20th century in the United States, highways are predominantly built through lower income neighborhoods, through Black and Hispanic and Asian neighborhoods. These are places where mega infrastructure goes to live. If we want to look to developments of real estate, you can look in rural areas to connections between confined animal feeding operations, a lot of which emit unpleasant smells, a lot of which have heavy deposits of not just odor, but toxifying nutrients that would then affect soil quality and water quality, downstream as well as acutely. Famous report again from the EPA, one of these foundational reports about environmental justice, finds that you're 3 times more likely to be Black if you live in a county with a higher number of CAFOs, swine CAFOs in your area. Failed regulation could be another aspect of this. If our regulatory system is designed to recompense people who have been harmed only through a long-standing legal process rather than by preventing the harm in the first place, then we see all manner of environmental harms to person and property manifesting through access to power through the legal system, whereby all kinds of harms from major storm events, from wildfires, from industrial disasters of various kinds might be technically illegal, but in practice quite difficult to get any kind of meaningful compensation from. So anthropology takes all that as kind of a given in an unequal society, in part because of this understanding that health is not merely individually taken in, but anthropology tends to focus less on the individual and more on this level just above the individual, where people form relationships between other people or other non-human things. And so what structural violence provides is this vocabulary that says that we're harmed not only by bad choices that we might make or ill-informed choices that we might make, we're also harmed by or given potential by the very structure of the systems in which we are embedded, whether they are social, whether they're economic, whether they're political, whether they are environmental. All of those structuring conditions that define how we move through the world and what kinds of things we can do. Again, another manifestation of power. Those are going to influence our health and our capacity for justice. Beyond that, anthropology would contribute some methodological considerations that would trouble some of this. So one of the approaches that anthropology takes is by drawing heavily on science and technology studies, understanding science as not necessarily the discovery and identification of facts that exist a priori out there in the world, but as science as one consensus-based form with a method of knowing things out there in the world. So if we take that anthropology of knowledge, that social science of knowledge kind of approach to how we measure risk in the first place, we are suddenly open to all kinds of other questions about power. Who can measure things? Who has access to measuring equipment? Why is it that this many parts per million create harm, whereas if we're 1 part per million under that, everything's just fine and we can build wherever we want to? These are questions of how we understand and create facts about the environment and health all around us. How do they intersect with power? Well, because of course that is inherently a question of who does the measuring and who sets those rules. Anthropologists will also think about contamination in general as one of the structuring conditions of life. There is a brand of anthropology called multi-species ethnography that takes into consideration this idea that we're not really bounded individuals. We don't exist outside of connection with other things, including past and present. Some of us have these long-standing relations to particles around us. We are living longer. Cancer is part of what it is to be alive. PFAS is, and microplastics are in all of us, whether or not we view them as contamination. Some of us have got uncles and aunties who we don't really love as part of our family. We've got that problematic kin. This is a way of thinking about a whole range of environments, not as toxins from outside, but as things that we kind of have to live with. The question of equality is always going to be there, and the question of the magnitude of these different kinds of harms is going to be important. A final methodological contribution that, or perspective that anthropology might take is not just in how we measure and who gets to measure and what those boundaries of measurement really look like in practice, but somewhat deeper than that, the very assumption that more surveillance is desirable by everyone, and that there is a right to the collection of data at all costs. The Métis scholar Max Lavoie-Ron up in Canada has recently wrote a book called Pollution is Colonialism, in part trying to link these processes of the colonial assumption of land as a thing to be used productively and understood scientifically, and contrast it to a different kind of, in their case, specifically indigenous epistemology, that is to say, a theory of knowledge, whereby land is a relative, land is a changing dynamic feature that has no owners and can have no owners. These are wildly different political claims that have consequences for who's allowed to own stuff and who can kick you off your property. The ways that we measure, the ways that any scientist would measure contamination assume some sort of right to the collection of personal data, assume some sort of right to the collection, to the ability to collect data on land, assume some sort of the right of the state to intervene in water, air, and the land beneath our feet. And while some of us, especially the recipients of a beneficent state, might say, this is wonderful, the state should be more involved in our lives, regulations are great. Those of us with a more complicated and genocidal history and relationship to the state, this being any state that participated in any kind of colonial action, are likely to have a different response to the assumed authority of a state organization who can come in at any time and do any kind of testing. These are political questions about the inherent harms of relationships between different kinds of people, the environment, government actors, and in many cases, the economy itself. Anthropologists have taken this perspective to make all kinds of observations. So there's that geographic link that Ellen was talking about a lot. You're more likely, if you're in a lower position of socioeconomic status, that is to say power, you're more likely to be exposed to these kinds of risks and have those sorts of risk factors. Anthropologists have taken the same approach and said that this manifests as well in some of the work that we do, case studies of women's labor and children's labor, as differentially exposing people to different kinds of toxins in the environment. We can look at some of the work that goes into maintaining and continuing our economic system, things like recycling, things like waste management, things like artisanal waste management. That is to say, that makes it sound fun and fancy, something you would buy on Etsy. This refers to people who burn garbage and extract metals from it, which is a common practice around much of the world. There's quite a bit of evidence to say that bleakly, in effect, what those communities are doing is becoming human sinks for toxins that stay in the environment, that they themselves, were they to be measured by state regulatory agencies, would be walking toxic sites. We can look at this with respect to the distribution of care and resources that might remediate these effects. Generally speaking, money can buy you a lot of distance from a lot of these contaminants, although not all of them. If we look especially at recent studies on microplastics and PFAS in universal water everywhere. This manifests as well through some of the explicit imperial aims of nations around the world, including military burn pits, as my colleague Kaleigh Karageorge studies in Iraq and also in Louisiana. These massive sites, you might have heard about this because it was a big deal for President Biden's son, who died of brain cancer, linked to this. The heavy burning, the burning of any heavy machinery tends to have a lot of risk for people who are near that. And so this was a big case from folks, first responders and fire responders involved in 9/11, but also anyone near, in the US military, near a burn pit. A reasonable question might also be what happens to Iraqis, civilians living nearby these burn pits who are equally contaminated, let alone the effective salting and destruction of that land. All of which, again, brings us back to the basic shared understanding from a qualitative social science point that any kind of injustice environmentally will manifest across a range of intersectional manifestations of power, both into how you can get care and resources to ameliorate that harm, and to what extent people are exposed to that harm. So methodological perspectives and case studies are a lot of how anthropologists intersect with these key ideas.
All right, that's fantastic. Hey, there's a real quick question in the chat that I think we can go ahead and take care of now. And it's, can you specifically point to our audience how they would go about finding some additional readings I need to wait till you have your headphones back. There you go. All right. That seems like an answer to that question.
This would be a great place to start for that. My colleague Laura Zanotti, who was a former head of a former version of the C4E, Institute for Sustainable Future, that is to say, has a lot of information about this, documented through her ongoing work with the Kayapo Nation in the Brazilian Amazon.
Right. And I think, Andrew, I think your talk just kind of, it's a quick glimpse into all of kind of the amazing things happening in your department, especially when you start to get into, I had a meeting with Zoe Nissa this morning, and she was telling me about some of the work she's doing on conservation treaties and how it intersects with environmental justice. Just a lot of really, really great stuff coming out of your department right now. So,
thank you. Come on by, everybody.
Right, here we go. So, all right, well, the last speaker on our list today was intended to be Lee Raymond. Lee had to step away, but we are excited because I think we got an upgrade. Let's go with that this afternoon. And so Kaleigh Karageorge is a third-year PhD student in the Department of Political Science, studying public policy and ecological sciences and engineering. Her interests lie at the intersection of environmental justice and policy, with her research primarily focusing on partnerships between non-governmental organizations in the United States, environmental justice movement. When I say an upgrade, Kaleigh, you were at our first meeting and we're one of the kind of the most passionate speakers. And so I kind of feel like you're already a member of this community, and I'm excited that we had an opportunity. We actually let her know yesterday. So I'm framing this out is that she had about 24 hours. I think the rest of the speakers had somewhere around 8 weeks. And so, but anyway, thank you so much for being with us. Can you go ahead and share your screen?
Yeah, absolutely. No problem. Excited to be here. All right. And yeah, like Aaron said, excuse the presentation. This was used for a class presentation first, and I think had some decent overlap with what we're talking about today. So can everyone see that?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, awesome. So I think we will see a lot of overlap both between Ellen's talks and Andrew's today. Ellen in regard to the history of the environmental justice movement and what environmental justice has looked like in the US, and Andrew in regard to some of these dimensions of power, as well as how we can see different forms of environmental injustices really culminate. Okay, so with that, in this presentation, I'll be talking a little bit about the conceptualization and exploration of environmental justice in the field of political science and how it relates to policy research more specifically. Okay, so similar to a lot of the work in the health and human sciences, we've really moved to this conceptualization of the environment as this bigger concept of where we work, live, and play. So historically, the environment in political science was thought of as purely nature or ecology and natural resources, things like forests and biodiversity, which really led many environmental policy practitioners and researchers to focus on the conservation and preservation aspects of resources and policy, while largely disregarding these more human dimensions of environmental dilemmas that we faced. So since this environmental justice discourse has really began to occur in the field, activists, academics, and policy practitioners alike have really moved to expand their definition with what they think of the environment and the environmental sphere. And this has in turn led to the movement of environmental away from white, middle, and upper class citizens and more toward the overall public as a whole. And like Dr. Walls mentioned, Robert Bullard was largely a key point for this reconceptualization, reimagination, and communication of what the environment really was. Oh. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to briefly touch on this history as we had a great presentation of it earlier. But before I dive into what, environmental justice has been understood as in policy and in our discipline, I want to go over this pretty brief timeline of what kind of led to this emergence of the political and policy aspects of environmental justice. So, like Ellen said, the environmental justice movement is formally recognized as beginning in Warren County, North Carolina, when they tried to cite a PCB soil contaminated PCB landfill in a largely marginalized community, one of the communities with the most people of color, as well as people below the poverty level in North Carolina. Now, while the resistance to cite this landfill did fail and the landfill was cited, we can look at this as the start of the environmental justice movement for a few reasons. So activists fighting back against this had essentially led environmental justice groups and grassroots groups concerned with these issues across the nation to really network and form this decentralized network of actors who were focused on these issues and concerned about them in different regions of the United States. Following this, the United Church of Christ Toxic Waste and Race report came out, as well as Bullard's Dumping in Dixie, which both proved this kind of correlation between marginalized communities and disproportionate citing of toxic waste, environmental hazards, and other environmental contaminants. Now, it also led to the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, and attendees here formulated these 17 principles of environmental justice, which I'm going to go ahead and link in this chat. Oh, I had it copied and pasted and it left. Let me get this back up here. Okay, sorry about this delay. Okay, and no one has to take a look at this now if they don't want to, but I want this available as a resource. So at this summit, one of the kind of key initiatives was to get more mainstream environmental organizations talking to grassroots actors and communities of color about these issues and really reconceptualizing what environmentalism was and what it meant. And following this meeting, this is when we started to see that more formal integration of policy into the United States government, such as the Office of Environmental Justice being created, and that mainstreaming of environmental justice into all other federal agencies. Okay, so with that being said, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what environmental justice means in political science and how we really conceptualize justice. But first, I think it's necessary to touch on the various kinds of injustices we see occurring and the various ways we can really see these effects culminating in our environments. So essentially, environmental justice, as we've talked about, has largely been construed as marginalized groups disproportionately being impacted by various environmental issues. So this disproportionate exposure and citing really increased in the 70s and 80s as environmental health concerns became more recognized following toxic waste citing at Love Canal, which was a community that was predominantly white and middle class and had the political capital and power to push back against these sightings. So as communities became more aware of the health impacts of these environmental exposures, everyone started realizing that they didn't want to confront these issues and they didn't want to be exposed to these environmental hazards. So essentially, government entities began citing these toxic waste dumps and other environmental hazards in marginalized communities who had less social capital and political power to push back against this citing and this disproportionate exposure. And Bullard and Wright, which Ellen also mentioned in her presentation, in 1987, they noticed that not in my backyard, NIMBY politics became place in Black's backyards. So essentially, we see this disproportionate siting differentially impacting marginalized groups and low-income groups more in the 70s and 80s as these environmental health concerns really took the forefront in the large public. So how do we actually see environmental injustice play out in practice? Similar to what we've talked about largely today and what people typically think of when they think about environmental injustice, we see greater exposure to environmental harms for these marginalized communities. An example of this could be industrial siting in minority communities, or minority communities being disproportionately exposed to carbon emissions or coal ash from electric generating facilities. Now, we also take into account that these marginalized groups can have less access to environmental benefits too. And this could look like less parks in low-income section of cities, or less green spaces in cities that have less political power to push for those green spaces. And these last two bullet points are a little bit more directly related to the policy field. So the first one is lack of representation in environmental decisions. And so this could look like comment periods being held during work hours, where certain groups of people are more likely to be working or less likely to attend these sessions. It could also look like certain groups being crowded out of community decisions. And finally, we can actually see secondary effects of policies that are intended to help the environment, hurting the communities that are located in those environments. So inequity in environmental policies during the design and the implementation stage, but also during policy enforcement and other environmental initiatives. So this could look like the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, expanding fossil fuel leasing in vulnerable communities. So while the intention of this is to overall mitigate carbon emissions and help us reach our goals to mitigate climate change, we also see it presenting huge issues for environmental justice. And so we see these trade-offs happening in a lot of these policies. Similarly, this could look like environmental groups focusing on narrower definitions of nature and disregarding the communities located in those environments. So for example, conservation groups pushing for, kind of us to stop poaching in other countries without realizing the context in that many communities are doing or engaging in these environmental activities to sustain themselves. This can also look like large environmental advocacy groups like the Sierra Club or the National Resource Defense Council, perhaps placing a higher premium on species or forestry rather than the human communities that are living in those realms. And so with environmental injustice kind of being explored and seeing how those things can culminate in practice, I think it's important for us to understand, kind of what makes policy and changes implemented just. So the EPA definition, which a lot of political science reference and policy practitioners reference, is listed right here. So this is more of the standard definition of EJ that kind of reconciles some of those components that we talked about together. And here, environmental justice is recognized as a fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. But political scientists have had kind of more nuanced ways of conceptualizing how we ensure policies are just. And here I'm going to turn to Schlossberg's kind of framework for the components of environmental justice and policy. And essentially, Schlossberg puts forth these three dimensions of environmental justice to describe the demands of the overall environmental justice movement, which have largely been used as an analytical framework for policy since then. And so here we see distributive justice, and this is a kind of justice we normally think of when we think about environmental injustice or environmental justice. And this is that equal distribution of benefits and burdens. So all groups are having equal access to the environment in the same ways or being hurt by the environment in the same ways. The participatory dimension addresses representation and involvement in decision-making processes. So ensuring that those groups that are affected by these issues are given a seat at the table and listened to. And finally, the recognitional component has been explored much less, mainly because of analytical issues and data issues. So kind of exploring this component is really hard to address with current methodologies in use. But this is the acknowledgement of the diversity of the impacted individuals and their experiences. So noticing that different people are going to have different conceptions of what justice looks like for them and also be impacted by injustices in different ways. Since Schlossberg's kind of promotion of this framework in 2004, a capabilities dimension has also been explored and takes this more thorough and nuanced conception of self-determination and autonomy of affected groups into account. But that, again, has been another dimension that has been kind of underexplored and underexamined. So in sum, this has been kind of the sort of framework underlying justice and policy, whether implicitly or explicitly. But the discipline as a whole has largely kind of used this as a way to assess, whether environmental injustices are occurring and how do we shape policy to make sure that they're more just. And yeah, I think that'll be it.
All right, that was fantastic. And so thank you to all three speakers. I'm sitting here kind of going through, right? It's like inviting your own education and background in this. And so, and again, I think largely what we're trying to do with this environmental justice special initiative is that we're just trying to kind of provide a way for us to start having a conversation and bringing together a community of people that want to think about this, that want to start working on this in their own work. And so what I would encourage you now is that if anyone has any questions for our speakers, let's go ahead and give an opportunity. You should be able to go ahead and, it's a small group, so I feel pretty comfortable if you want to go ahead and unmute and ask a question. All right, I'm not seeing anything right off the top of my head, right? So I'm gonna actually just ask I prepared one question in advance, which was, I asked each one of you to approach it from a disciplinary perspective, and it was very, for me, taking notes and kind of thinking through where I fit within this. It was easy to see some of the areas where there was a lot of overlap in kind of between kind of the philosophy, the methods, and kind of what's going on with the research. And I'm curious to hear from the speakers, what jumped out from you that was unique or different, right? So what would you kind of use to define as some of the differences? Maybe we'll start with Ellen.
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought there were a lot of similarities. A couple of things that stood out to me is that with public health and in environmental health science, we're very much focused on health outcomes as kind of the end goal of what we study. And in large part, I got attracted to that because a lot of policy is really driven by human health, right? So we protect the environment if a dirty environment would make us sick somehow, and that's usually the justification for it. But environmental justice really goes beyond that, as was very well characterized by my colleagues, and I appreciate the discussions of power and representation and access that everyone else was talking about. And I think those are also very important, but things that we don't talk about as much within environmental public health circles.
Right. Well, maybe we can jump over to Andrew, because building off of that, the thing that stood out for me as I was kind of taking notes on this is that you really came back to this defining the reason for the inequalities, and right, we live in an inequality or an unequal society, right? You said that, used similar phrasing a couple of different times. How does that affect? In terms of working directly with communities, how does that affect approach when it comes to actually developing the science and the methodology and how you as a researcher, kind of approach these problems?
Yeah, it's fundamental to a lot of how the work that I try to do and the work that my colleagues do in and around that issue. I think what the anthropology kind of answer to that question would be is that there are no research questions that kind of come from nowhere. There is no objective experiment. There are people living their lives within a situated history and political economy. And so if I want to look at some phenomenon, and it's possible for me to look at that phenomenon without really talking to anybody or being curious about what it feels like to live through that, that's generally not an anthropological kind of question that we would ask. And there's a huge range of how people are incorporated into this larger tapestry of participatory or community-based participatory kinds of approaches. Sometimes it means asking people to go collect data based on their own experience, like a citizen science approach that wouldn't question the underpinnings of science itself. Sometimes there are approaches that are initially based from the grassroots, where you say, I'm not coming with a research question. I know that you're living here and there's this context. What are the things that you would like to investigate and how can we work toward that? And there's quite a lot of things in between there, depending on what everybody's kind of goals are within that. I see a hand from Laura, and I don't want to derail you, but I want to make sure that people from the audience.
Right, I'm right there with you. I saw it come up too. So, hey, Laura, how are you?
I'm good. Yeah, you guys could finish. I just didn't get fast enough when Aaron asked if anyone had a question. But so I'm in the entomology department, for those of you who don't know me. And I work very, very much on the applied side of food production. But, I've been in conversation with some of you and a part of developing some interdisciplinary grants. And I'm kind of curious of what your perspectives are or strategies to bring together all of these different disciplines, because I think that all of our speakers today have really important aspects that can help strengthen some of the work we want to do on the applied side. And I saw that someone's here from the Institute for Sustainable Futures, but logistically, it's really, really difficult. And so I would love to hear some examples of success where you're sort of weaving together the social side and the human experience and the health side, along with changes in policy and access to things related to health, and specifically in agriculture. That's where I'd like to hear more about that, if you can.
And that's a fantastic question, Laura. It's also really, it's also a huge challenge, right? And it's why we're bringing together this community, because we're trying to figure out how to work across. I think, if we start getting into the differences, I can already start to see how we need all three of these different disciplines together in any given project if we're going to be really successful on the ground. But your request for kind of a specific example is actually where I was going to go next, which is, Kaleigh, you're studying environmental justice with nonprofit organizations here in the US. Can you give us, the 90-second elevator pitch about the work that you're doing, and maybe just help us conceptualize what an environmental justice study looks like from a research standpoint in policy sciences?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and weave together some of the methodological things we've talked about.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the kind of main concerns I've had with my research within my discipline specifically is that we're kind of going through this quantitative data revolution in the political sciences, right? So I think it's really useful to draw from other disciplines. I would say I predominantly draw from sociology, but in our exploration of these questions, and I'm really interested in the work that my other colleagues are doing on this community engaged research, because I also kind of engage with that in my own dissertation work, but am largely not finding that occurring in our overall field, rather than like just the environmental portion of our field. But as far as my personal research goes, I look at partnerships between non-governmental organizations in the environmental justice movement. So practically what that looks like is how do we study kind of these coalitions that build. And I look specifically at between elite non-governmental organizations and grassroots environmental justice organizations. So I briefly discussed that rift, that historic rift between these two groups in my presentation, and we still see some components of that. And because there's these huge power differentials between these groups in practice, we see that effective coalitions are difficult to build on the ground that are both mutually beneficial and where these groups can maintain autonomy, specifically the smaller grassroots groups. So I'm interested in how these groups can work together and maintain autonomy, because a lot of times we'll see that these smaller groups dissolve or because they're not able to gain funding and the resources they need to achieve their goals. But when they do partner with these larger advocacy organizations, a lot of times we see co-optation occurring, or basically their initiatives and goals being subsumed by these larger organizations in order to gain resources. So I'm interested in the autonomy of grassroots groups largely. Now, to kind of draw on Laura's question here, I think cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary partnerships are really vital to this research, right? Because I see a lot in the sciences, many researchers missing these human dimensions. And while those I think are starting to kind of become common in those arenas, which is really exciting to see, I think that this social science perspective that, for example, Andrew contributed is really getting glossed over or kind of half-heartedly integrated into these more scientific approaches. So I think when we see these teams kind of collaborate, we see like a more authentic representation of what these perspectives need to look like.
Right. No, that's a wonderful response, and thank you for sharing. Laura, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, or just sort of an observation that I wanted to comment on. Kaleigh, when you were talking about those sort of grassroots initiatives fizzling out, I see that a lot in urban agriculture. And I mean, that's particularly the field that I work with, but you see so much passion and you see so much movement of people starting farms with this social goal to improve their neighborhood and the goal of feeding the community, but they don't have access to the resources that other farms have, or the expertise, the capital, whatever that may be. And so unfortunately, I think they fizzle out a lot. And so really understanding why that is and how to facilitate partnerships to help increase the success would be really interesting.
Right.
Anyways, we should talk more.
Right. Absolutely. Well, you should just keep coming to all of these meetings and be part of this environmental justice community is what it is. So, hey, Lynn's offered to also kind of, toss in. So Lynn, do you want to join us here real quick?
Yeah, sure. I'm, ghosting as Purdue ISF. Sorry about that. And I'm assuming that's Laura Ingwell. Is that the Laura who's on?
Yes,
Yeah.
that is the troublemaker that's on this call. So.
No, I thought it was because I was just talking to Yumari Ruiz this morning, and she was talking about your collaboration, which kind of addresses this issue as well. So I was bringing Yumari on board, and as a plug, we are bringing Seth Holmes to campus March 1st, and he is a anthropology, public health kind of expert who's worked on migrant farmers in California and nationwide. And so we're developing a scientific panel that kind of addresses environmental justice with an emphasis on public health and immigration, which we're going to be investigating this kind of a public logo slogan of Indiana grown, and the idea of unpacking what that means for public health and racial inequality. So I hope you guys, and Andrew Flachs will be participating as the moderator for that event on March 1st. But more directly to this question, I think it's a really good question, Laura. And if you look at the funding opportunities in this space, I mean, there's a lot of funding right now that involves EJ because of President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, in which 40% of funds that are funneled through federal agencies related to the Inflation Reduction Act and other, mega legislation in the past year requires 40% to quote unquote flow through to disadvantaged communities. And that's something, well, that terminology is something I'm curious to talk to Ellen about at some point, is what do we call an EJ community versus a disadvantaged community? Because I've heard the term EJ community being used in almost a negative way from by industrial kind of corporate entities. But to address your question, so I think it's a real challenge because, for example, in Justice 40 initiatives, that those monies need to go directly to communities for projects, and usually incorporate local community groups, but it somewhat excludes the engagement and partnership with university researchers in that space who are actually, studying some aspect of environmental justice impacts or outcomes in a community. So there's a little bit of a disconnect. So I think Ellen is probably could comment on this too. We often have funds to, maybe from NIH or maybe EPA to work in a community, but we can't, for example, if Ellen gets a grant for $800,000, she can't give $200,000 to an impact a community to create a park or increase green space, right? So I think it's a real challenge, but I would also say, Laura, that moving forward in this upcoming year with these opportunities for funding, there is more of an opportunity to work with our extension specialist partners at Purdue. And it's something that ISF and myself personally and Matt personally, and I think people in this community as well, want to create more bonds with folks who are doing applied work and are in extension, who might, to create these information flows and feedback loops that we can make a higher impact. And for me, that's one reason I think it's really great to be working at a land grant institution, to really have that as a fundamental part of your mission, to be doing that work within the various communities in the state. So maybe I answered some questions there and maybe raised some more.
Right. Well, thank you, Lynn. So, and thank you, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up at this point. Ellen and I wanted to make sure we kept this under 1 hour and 15 minutes, just to be respectful of everyone's time this afternoon. Again, there will be some more information coming out from the Environmental Justice Special Initiative, so look for emails from Ellen and I. We hope to get everybody together and continue this community building process, and hopefully be working towards some of these collaborations that we're talking about, so that we can start to kind of put some of these pieces together. It would be really, really exciting to see, especially the strong social policy sciences connecting with public health, and really that taking the lead in some of the work that Purdue's doing in this space. And I'd love to, be part of helping that move forward. So again, thank you again so much to our speakers. Kaleigh, thank you for stepping in last minute. You did a wonderful job, really, especially as I was looking at just providing that active policy making and engagement and participation, right? You did such a great job of framing out kind of those pieces of how do we move forward, right? Really wonderful work there. So, all right, hopefully, look for more information from us, and we will follow up on the next event, and we hope to see all of you again.
Yeah, thanks for coming,
Thank-
everybody.